And now on the line is Michelle Murphy. Michelle, as many of our listeners to this programme on Near FM will know, is a research and policy analyst with Social Justice Ireland. Michelle, welcome back to Near FM.
Thank you, Darren.
Michelle, I read your press release about your report published on Monday, Social Justice Matters 2023, and I read up a lot of your tweets on Twitter on the day about it. You are calling for a new social contract. Can you tell our listeners on Near FM, Michelle, more about your call for a new social contract and about the publication of your latest report in general?
Of course, Darren. So if anyone wants to look at the report, they can go to socialjustice.ie. And I suppose we're calling for a new social contract because we think the benefits of Ireland's growing economy should be harnessed to ensure a fair distribution of life's necessities. And by that, I mean so that people have affordable accommodation, that they can access affordable housing, that they can access healthcare when they need it, they can get their GP appointment, access to education for all children, regardless of their abilities or needs, and sustainability. Because I suppose we have a situation at the moment where, our headline economic figures are going really well. We've record levels of growth since the pandemic. We're at full employment, more or less. But at the same time, we have nearly 670 people living in poverty. We've a housing crisis, a homelessness crisis. So there's a big disconnect, I suppose, between economic progress and actually people's everyday lives.
In other words, there's huge inequality in Ireland, yeah?
There is still, and I don't think it gets the attention that it deserves. And I suppose now, we're into the second year of a rising costs, high inflation, a cost of living crisis. And I suppose that those levels of inequality are really having an impact.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying about inequality not getting the attention it deserves maybe in the media, but I think personally, Michelle, that a lot of people in the general public are concerned with the level of inequality in Ireland, and I think that a lot of the people who are concerned about it may not be working for any social justice organisations and groups. Do you, Michelle, in Social Justice Ireland, believe that inequality is acknowledged to be a big issue by a lot of the general public in Ireland?
I think you're right, Darren. I think a lot of the public have a greater grasp or understanding of it than maybe some of our politicians. And I think maybe that feeds into, I suppose, the recent debate when the president made a speech a couple of weeks ago. And I suppose he criticised the focus of, traditional economic theory on, focusing on growth and continual growth and things like GDP. And he was pointing out that, if we're going to meet our climate targets, then we need to get away from a focus on growth. And I think he was also pointing out the reality for many people. Like, we have a country that on the one hand, as I said, GDP growth, we've 10 billion euros already additional that government didn't think it would have before the budget to spend. Yet it's a country people can't afford to live in. Young people can't find a home. It's impossible to find a house to rent. You have people in their 70s facing homelessness. You have, nearly 188,000 children living in poverty. So as you say, I think a lot of your listeners and just people from every walks of life, I think they do, because they interact with it more on a daily basis, as opposed to, I suppose, our TDs and senators who do spend a lot of their time in Leinster House, and maybe they're a bit disconnected from the reality of everyday life.
Okay, I think personally, I think this for a long time, even before COVID, but I think that inequality is so stark in Ireland and some other countries in the Western world. But I think that, I think this is common among social justice causes around the world, that I think the hopelessness is maybe the biggest enemy. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think, because what happens is then the problem seems to get so big that, people feel that they can't tackle it. And I think you could say the same nearly about the climate challenge. But the reality is we can. We have the money to do it. It just requires political will and people who are in decision-making positions, and by that I mean our elected representatives and and people who work for them in the civil service, making the right policy choices and actually prioritising people, prioritising community. Put the people and community first when you're talking about investing in infrastructure, investing in services. I mean, there's absolutely no point in presenting papers to government on what to do with 10 billion euros that you have at your disposal and either putting it in a sovereign wealth fund or a rainy day fund. I mean, that's no good for anyone if they can't access a home. If even when they're in work and they have a job, they're still on an income below the poverty line. If you have children, you can't put food on the table or pay your bills. And I think it shows maybe a lack of vision amongst our politicians that they can't see the very obvious deficits we have in our infrastructure that they could invest that money in. Because now that we've been through bad times, some very bad times, we've been through the financial crash. I suppose the economy did well after the crash. We've been through a pandemic, but still the economy is doing reasonably well. So we should be using the resources that we have to actually deliver a better standard of living for everyone. And, you can tackle poverty if it's a political priority. Of course it can be tackled. Of course it can be addressed. And we know, and the thing is, we know what lifts people out of poverty. It's increasing their income, and social welfare rates are a key element of that for those groups. And I'm talking about here, older people, carers, people with a disability, lone parents. It's, rising their incomes through increasing core social welfare rates actually lifts those groups out of poverty. We know that. We have the evidence. We have the data to show that when government has done that in the past, they have they have made progress in addressing poverty and inequality. But the reality is it's not a priority, or it certainly doesn't seem to be at this point for them. So therefore, we're not making progress.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you that, you don't need to go into many of your policies because I understand that you're calling for a few things in your recent report, but are there any other kind of big things the government can do, do you think, over the next year or two or few years?
Well, I suppose the first one thing, and as I've said, Darren, we have the resources, so they shouldn't be trying to pitch different parts of society against the other. It's not an either or decision. You can support people on social welfare and fixed incomes, and you can also support households with jobs. You don't have to make a choice. You don't have to pit those two groups against each other. The government can do both. It's a choice. And it's up, they either choose to do it or they choose not to do it, but they can't say that they don't have the money, that they do. And then the other thing I would say is that we have to look at, in the longer term, how we fund our services going forward. Our population has grown and it's also aging. So we are going to need more money for pensions. There's going to be more money required for the healthcare service. So it's looking at big ticket items like that. And then obviously, we have very, very challenging climate targets to meet by 2030. And it can't just be up to individuals to do all the heavy lifting. We have to look at sectors, that have to meet the targets that have been set out for them in the climate action plan and the climate budgets. And I really think government, we can't be waiting for another 2-3 years. There's only 7 years for us to reach those targets. We really need to start seeing some progress on that now as well. And so those would be the kind of key items we are saying to government, and we will continue to say.
Okay, Michelle, we'll talk about all these issues again on AirFM. I won't keep it much longer. It was announced a couple of months ago that your CEO on Social Justice Ireland, Seán Healy, will retire at the end of this year. Before you go, Michelle, do you want to just say something about the impact on social justice Seán Healy has had and still does have, and about how different your organisation, Social Justice Ireland, is going to be without him?
Yeah, I mean, Seán Healy and Brigid Reynolds, so they're both retiring at the end of the year. So Brigid was the company secretary, and I mean, they've made an immense contribution to social justice, not just in Ireland but in Africa as well. In the 1970s. But I think what Seán and Brigid have really done in their work here is, they've brought, I suppose, social justice issues into the mainstream. And, all the work that they have done is to make sure that those who are poor and vulnerable are kind of front and centre, because their voice isn't heard. People who are living on low incomes are, they're struggling just to get by on a day-to-day or weekly basis. They're not out marching on the streets. They don't get airtime. They're not on the radio. They're not on the television because, they're just trying to get by. So I think probably one of the greatest contributions they've had is to make sure that that voice is heard, and also his contribution to public policy. So I think he'll be a huge loss. Seán has so much energy. I don't think there's enough hours in the day for Seán. He has a huge amount of energy and commitment, and we're going to miss him hugely, but I think he's left a huge legacy with Social Justice Ireland, and I think we're in a very strong position. And we will, Darren, be having an event in early 2024, I suppose, to honour the legacy, and I'm sure I'll be able to tell your listeners more about that later in the year.